All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thanks for coming to City Forum. I'm Alex Carner, Associate Professor in Community and Regional Planning. I'm the Faculty Coordinator for City Forum. I want to thank my GRA, Abigail Jackson, for making all the City Forum events happen. So thanks, Abigail, for your help. And then the next seminar that we're going to have is going to be in 2 weeks. Tara Dudley from School of Architecture is going to present on November 17th. That'll be the last one of this semester. So please try to come to that. I'm gonna, if you've come to the prior City Forums, you know that I'm gonna offer a land acknowledgement here that resists Indigenous erasure and supports Indigenous people in their ongoing struggles. So over time, Indigenous people residing in Central Texas have faced disease, war, genocide, and forced relocation. The tribes that have and continue to call Central Texas home include the Alabama Coshada, the Caddo, the Carrizo Comecrudo, Cuauhtecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, as well as other American Indian and Indigenous people and communities. I'm also plugging this ongoing struggle to return the remains that are held by the Texas Archaeological Research Lab on the Pickle campus. So if you just do a quick search for UT Return the Remains, you can head over to a link with the Indigenous Cultures Institute. There's an open letter you can sign to President Hartzell urging him to end the delay in return and take immediate action to return several ancestors to the Miacan Garza band of Cuauhtecans. Okay, so turning to our seminar speaker today, someone who needs no introduction. Katherine Lieberknecht is an assistant professor in community and regional planning here in School of Architecture. And Katherine's work is really a testament to the belief that impactful scholarly research should not only cross disciplinary boundaries, but also bridge the gaps between academia and the real world communities it aims to serve. As the inaugural chair of Planet Texas 2050 and through the multiple projects that have flowed from it, Dr. Lieberknecht has not only led groundbreaking research, but has also cultivated a culture of equity, inclusivity, and collaboration, ensuring that the needs of those most affected by climate change are placed front and center when crafting mitigation and adaptation strategies. Whether it's through the National Science Foundation funded project on co-creating climate resilience strategies for Dove Springs, or the Department of Energy funded Southeast Texas Urban Integrated Field Laboratory, she's consistently championed a community-led approach to climate adaptation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Katherine Lieberknecht as she continues to guide us through the complex intersections of environmental and climate planning and social equity.
Thank you, Alex. That's very kind. Hey, everyone. It's good to see you all. I've got this mic to record, and I'm not using the room projection because sometimes there's feedback. Can you guys hear me okay without it? Okay, just at any time let me know if you can't, and Cole can help fix it. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I think, did you write that, Alex? That was really very touching. Thank you. I should swap that out for whatever I have on my faculty page. Yeah, thank you. When I'm feeling low, I'll just read that. Yes. Well, it's good to see everyone. It's a little bit of like a SLUP reunion from last year, and I see some folks from my electives this year, and appreciate faculty taking the time to come here as well, and got to just talk to some of our doctoral students. I see a contingent of those folks. As Alex said, I'm Katherine Lieberknecht, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Community Regional Planning Program. And today, actually, I'm going to set my alarm because I know Abigail will rein me in, but I want to make sure that there is time for discussion. But it really can be free-flowing. So if there are things, as I'm presenting material, if you have questions like clarifications, things that you want to share, I think that's totally fine to kind of pause this and dig in. But we'll also leave time at the end. And I also have my last slide is kind of all the things I've been kind of worried about and thinking about and would love input on. So we've got some kind of discussion primers there as well. And I have, wow, this is like, so what a nice setup. I've got slide clicker, I got the mic, I don't have to stand right here. So just kind of get started for today, what I thought I would do is just give a little introduction to myself, like how I became interested in community engaged climate adaptation work in particular. And then focus on this particular case in general. I think when Alex and I corresponded this summer, I was like, okay, we've got to just focus on one thing for this talk, not a bazillion things. So I decided what I would do is kind of share out from a research project that I'm a part of, not the lead. The lead is Paula Pasalacqua and engineering program. But I'm a co-lead of one of the themes, or lead of one of the themes in it, which is called the Southeast Texas Urban Integrated Field Laboratory, which is a title that is very much from the proposal. And we can talk about that too. But that's the case I thought I'd kind of walk us through, thinking about kind of these community-led, community-engaged, or community-focused kind of climate justice work, particular climate adaptation. And then I wanted to wrap up just with some of the bigger picture challenges I've been thinking about and kind of grappling with through this work in the Gulf Coast, through work here in Austin, And maybe you guys can help me kind of see a new pathway. I'd appreciate feedback on it. But just a little introduction to myself and how I got focused on this work. And I was just speaking with the doctoral students and kind of just covered the same ground, so forgive me. But my family moved here to Austin when I was 7. We kind of lived in Southwest Austin, kind of Oak Hill area. And Williamson Creek was in our backyard. And our house was built in the 80s, so it was actually sited out of the floodplain. So when it would flood, it would come all the way up our backyard and then go back down again. It was a very long backyard. And this is pretty much what it looked like, down at the creek. And it was a super bucolic place to grow up with my sisters and kind of my neighbor friends just playing in the creek. And I'm just one of those people, I am happier outside than inside. And it was just a lot of time playing in the creek and going to parks with my parents. And really just instilled a real love of nature in me. And I understand that not everyone wants to do that, but I definitely, as a planner, want to make sure that if people want to have kind of these amenities in and around cities, that they're accessible to everyone, right? So I was a kid, so I didn't know about the 1928 plan, and I know you guys all know about the 1928 plan in Austin because we cover it in multiple classes. But I could see the plan, or at least the legacy of the plan, because the time that we moved here was also happened to be about the 10 years or so that the Austin Public School District was actually in compliance with desegregation busing. So as a way to try to desegregate our school system here in Austin, for about 10 years, we'd bus kids back and forth from East to West Austin. So that's the kind of historic divide that was solidified during the 1928 plan that kind of created a wealthier, whiter West Austin and a lower income East Austin with fewer resources and services and infrastructure. So I didn't know the why and I didn't know the what, but every day on the bus, going from West Austin over to Ortega Elementary, which is kind of south and east of us across Airport Boulevard, I could kind of see the legacy of this plan and the way that the parks looked, or the prevalence of parks, or the absence of parks, or the way the creeks looked, if they looked like this in my backyard, or if they were kind of concrete channels. So I didn't really have the words for it, and I certainly didn't have the theoretical framework for it as a kid, but I could kind of see the evidence of it. So as an adult, went into land conservation work because that was kind of where my heart is, just like wanting to make sure people have access to those things that basically kind of keep me together as a human. Kind of the mental health I have is because of that, I think, in part. But also really thinking about the inequity of my hometown and access to this and other resources. So I went into land conservation and worked there professionally for a while, and then discovered planning kind of later in life in my 20s and found like, oh, these are my people. Went back to got my doctorate and focused on kind of equity issues and land conservation. And then eventually was able to move back to Austin in 2012. And the year we got back, we were just coming out of this really severe drought. So that top image, this even probably has a thing. This top image is a thing. Thank you. Words, please. Of Texas before the drought, relatively green, and this a year later, it's just like all the water just sucks out of the soil, and the vegetation's all dried up. So we were just emerging from that. And then the year after we got back, there was the Halloween flood in 2013 in Onion Creek. So this was a creek that floods periodically, but such a severe flood that 5 people drowned trying to evacuate, right? And we just came up on that 10 years since that this week. And that really kind of, being back in the place where I grew up, that really kind of drove home that, okay, climate change is here. I don't have to go somewhere else to see it. I can see the impacts of this extended heat and drought, or in this case, the flooding on the communities that I know and love. And it really made me think that, yes, I'm going to keep on doing research on kind of green infrastructure and ecosystem services and nature-based solutions, but I also want, how can I contribute to what needs to happen with the climate crisis? Because each of us have a role. It's all hands on deck at this point. And I figured climate adaptation is probably the place I fit best as an environmental planner. So I'll talk about that in a second. And I will also say, too, I think just really the flood really hit home for me, too, just hearing in past 5 years working in that neighborhood that got flooded, hearing stories of families and hearing of kids that just kind of re-traumatized flood after flood, and having kids of my own at the same time. Like, life is unpredictable and you can't protect your kids from everything, but if you know it's going to flood, which we do, we can protect people from that, right? So it just felt very urgent. So before I kind of hop into the work, I just wanted to make sure you guys know what I'm focusing on. So climate mitigation versus adaptation. Mitigation is kind of what we're doing as planners and others, designers, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're trying to reverse the emissions of greenhouse gases, or stop it, or reduce it. So as planners, we're creating more active transportation networks, more mass transit opportunities is one way to reduce fossil fuel use. I work on the adaptation piece. So that's kind of here, the climate crisis is here. What can we do to prepare for and reduce the impact of these climate-related events that are happening? So for instance, having a voluntary home buyout program to get people out of a floodplain could be a type of adaptation. And there's problems with that, and we can talk about that. And I see Liz is here, so we can talk about that together, because we have been thinking a lot about kind of equitable relocation programs. I just mentioned this here because it is confusing, because when we talk about climate adaptation, sometimes we also talk about mitigation for climate adaptation, so it's like all the same nouns. But I just want to kind of emphasize that I'm working on this adaptation piece in this research I'm about to describe. And there might be some spin-offs, like kind of new greener economies that come out of this work, but it's really focused on the adaptation piece. So, this is Houston after Hurricane Harvey. Buffalo Bayou Park, it's functioning as a place for the flood water, that 60 inches of rain that we got, to stay before it can kind of safely drain off. So that's an adaptation example, and then you can kind of see the skyline in the back. Imagine the transportation infrastructure, and then I'm not working on this piece, but other planners and designers are working to make those buildings less carbon focused, or involve less carbon in the operations of the buildings themselves, or in the transportation infrastructure, how people are moving around, or the economy. So, and then the last thing of background I want to give before we hop into the case is just thinking about climate justice and the relationship to climate adaptation, right? And I'm sure you guys in the room all know this, but the people who contributed the least to the climate crisis are the ones that are feeling the brunt of it. They're feeling it more intensely. And there's lots of reasons for that, but low-income households, community colors, the structurally oppressed are feeling climate change impacts in a disparate way. And then, ironically, sometimes the very work we do to prepare communities for climate change through climate adaptation, we can sometimes deepen climate injustice itself through that work, usually inadvertently, not always, though, the case. And we can talk about that more if you want to, kind of in discussion, but I'm just going to move through this kind of quickly. So this is not the only way to do this, but one of the ways you can address that tension of making sure that climate adaptation, preparing for these climate events, is not making climate injustice worse, is by doing climate adaptation that's responsive to local needs, to local knowledge, to local desires. So adaptation work that, yes, we're using big data sets that planners have access to, but we're also integrating information from people who are there experiencing these events. And that's hard. We talk about this in planning all the time. It's like, of course we want meaningful participation, but how do you do that, right? Inclusive decision-making, power sharing, co-production, so creating knowledge together. These are tough things to get done. But that is one of the pathways to kind of push us towards more climate justice-focused adaptation work. And then just quickly, the image at the top is an image of a neighborhood in Alaska, which is kind of collapsing into the ocean because of coastline erosion, right? From sea level rise and from increased wave action. So that's an example of how, in this case, a relatively low-income community, an indigenous community, is bearing the brunt of climate change already, and had a minimal amount of action that actually created that situation. And then the bottom photo is a group of climate navigators. So these are residents in Dub Springs neighborhood that I've been working with for a couple years on climate adaptation work. So they're working on an exercise together, kind of ranking different types of tools that they think would be helpful. So that's an idea of okay, yes, there are some things we can do to kind of increase power sharing and decision making. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about here is how do we get at that, right? So the case study I thought I'd present, and this is new work from January, and I think I was just reflecting on this with Abigail. The last time I've had 45 minutes to tell a research story, it's been a long time because these academic talks are 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So I'm really excited to share this project. It is a new project we just launched in January. I actually have the first set of information from the residents we're working with as they define the problems in this area, but I haven't, there's not a full paper yet to present. So, but I think it's a good case study for us to think about this tension of ensuring that adaptation doesn't worsen climate injustice and kind of the challenge of having this meaningful engagement and participation in the climate adaptation work that we do. So the story begins spring almost 2 years ago in spring. The Department of Energy issued this new call for proposals for this new program that they're calling the Urban Integrated Field Laboratories. And this is the Department of Energy, so they fund a lot of climate research, they fund a lot of hydrology, geology, they don't fund a lot of social science research. What they had decided to do, partly in response to President Biden's environmental justice initiatives, was to expand their focus using this model that they had of these kind of existing integrated field laboratories, which are basically just kind of study sites across the US where researchers are collecting climate data, doing climate modeling, collecting hydrology data, doing hydrology modeling, kind of monitoring what's happening environmentally and helping us kind of use, putting that information out there, hoping that decision makers kind of are able to use it. So the Department of Energy decided to take that model, but focus it on cities, and then do two other things which were pretty new for the Department of Energy. The second thing that they did was that in the call, they said the work has to have an express kind of co-design piece of it, which is that it's not just enough to say, we're producing better information and communities will use this. You have to work with communities in some way and work together and kind of link the data that you're collecting, the environmental data and modeling, to a community's need. And then in theory, this is kind of the piece we elaborate with, is like actually then also take the information from the community and loop that back into the data observations and the modeling. And then the third kind of new innovation that they did was that it also has to focus on equity. And this was new as well for a Department of Energy program that I know of. So we saw this call and we're like, oh, let's apply for this. It was a short time frame. Paula, as I said, Pasalakwa from engineering led the charge. And we tossed our kind of proposal in the hat. We decided to focus it on the Gulf Coast, and particularly in Beaumont and Port Arthur, which is like, I'm not very good with this little wiggle thing. This little, sorry, there we go, is that right there with the Neches River coming down. So we focused on Port Arthur and Beaumont, and actually kind of the argument that we made in this proposal was based on data that Dr. Michael Oden had put together as part of an earlier Planet Texas 2050 project, basically kind of making the case that if we're going to study urban areas under these conditions of climate change and areas of vulnerability, that this part of the Gulf Coast is a really important part to focus on. And that is because it is a place that is experiencing these kind of acute events, so hurricanes and big rainstorms, or fires in refineries. But there's kind of this underlying chronic environmental conditions, a lot of it having to do with air quality in addition to that. So we're calling it kind of acute on chronic kind of climate issues. And then, in addition to that, there's, sorry, just want to make sure it's not my alarm yet. It's not. So it's not a big city. They're not big cities, but there has been kind of continuous urban expansion in the area and increase impervious cover. It's coastal. If you guys have been, who's from this area? I meant to ask. Thank you. Yeah, where are you from?
I'm from Houston, but I've passed it Beaumont a few number of times. They're very similar.
Yeah, like same kind of ecosystem. That's just what I was going to say. Like digging into this proposal, it is such a the ecosystem there is so rich. It's amazing. It's like a biodiversity, I had no idea, biodiversity hotspot. These estuaries along the coastline are just beautiful and, just tons of wildlife. And it's also heavily industrialized, right? I mean, some of the biggest refineries in the world are located here. So it's such an interesting place. So kind of laid this all out. It's also in the top 10% of most polluted communities in the US. A quarter of families and 40% of kids living in poverty. And, we were trying to make an argument that basically, yes, this is a small study area compared to, Boston, but it really represents those kind of urban conditions and this part of the Gulf Coast where there's kind of this concentration of refineries and industrialization for the fossil fuel economy kind of stretching into Louisiana and beyond. And they bought it. They funded 3 that first year and a 4th the next year. And if you kind of look at these, it's like Baltimore, Chicago, Arizona, which is kind of that Phoenix to Tucson corridor, and then Southeast Texas, Beaumont, Port Arthur. So it is different. It's not a big city like these other ones. Baltimore and Phoenix have seen decades of investment from the federal government and kind of social ecological research in these long-term ecological research sites. The Chicago one is led by a national lab, so they are all kind of like big heavy hitters. But speaking to the program officer afterwards, they're like, we were not going to fund anything in this region. It's small, we're thinking big cities. But this kind of case was so compelling that if you're thinking about these issues of climate justice and adaptation and better linking kind of the wealth of data coming out of this modeling to on-the-ground conditions, this is a really important place to consider it. And the other thing maybe just to mention too is that, a place like Austin, we do have our share of climate challenges, but we are a very data-rich community. We have a lot of planners on staff, right? That's not necessarily the case here in Beaumont. So this project has at this point, like around 80 research team members. It's 5 institutions. It's UT as the lead. It's Texas A&M, so we're working together with the Aggies. It's Lamar University, which is based in Beaumont itself, and then Prairie View A&M, and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is in Tennessee, but kind of for these projects, you have to partner with the national lab, and they were gracious enough to go along for the ride with us with our kind of water modeling. We did have, it's a little bit of a different project than I've worked on, is that these other externally funded projects I've worked on, we've had the relationships first with stakeholders. We've worked with stakeholders to identify the problem, written the proposal with them together around that climate problem, and then got the funding to address that problem that they defined. And there wasn't time to do this, so instead, we had this existing network of stakeholders in the region that some of our research team had worked with, some for a number of years. They were all on board, but we didn't have time to do that pre-work together. So I've always felt a little unsteady about that, because it's, as a planner, that's not the position I want to be in necessarily, but it was also a great opportunity to get this funding and see if it could be of help in this area. It's a 5-year project with a $17 million budget. You know, I think we found out afterwards we're the smallest budget. We probably should have asked for a little more, but it's okay. It's enough to get the work done. And this is the basic setup. Just like I was saying, we're trying to like link that kind of data observation, modeling capacity of those Department of Energy funded integrated field laboratories, but link it to planning, link it to action, and doing it in community. So working together with community members to kind of link that information, link their local knowledge, and apply it to climate adaptation strategies. So the kind of the structure of the project, it's kind of 3 research teams. This green one is the kind of environmental data. So it's climate and water and air quality data observations and modeling. And then this orange piece, that's the piece I lead. It's called co-design, which is language from the proposal, but it is used in planning. So basically just the idea is you're working with communities collaboratively to do something. In this case, we're trying to design climate adaptation strategies together. The third piece is equity. So led by social scientist Michelle Meyer at A&M. If you guys are familiar with her work, it's fantastic. And their job, they have their own research agenda too, but their other job is to keep reminding the environmental scientists to always think about equity when they're doing their observations. So when they're setting out sensors, where are they placing them? Have they had a conversation with the community that they're going into before they put the sensor out, before the community member's like, what is that, right? Reminding us kind of how to work in community on this research together. And then we work really closely with them and co-design to make sure that where we're selecting the sites, the kinds of adaptation strategies we're working through reflect kind of the demographic data and challenges of the area. So that's the basic overview, and I won't go into, this is kind of research proposal-y language, but basically kind of the big research questions are, kind of thinking about the processes and variables in those data and modeling pieces of work and linking them to on-the-ground knowledge and kind of pushing forward climate adaptation together. How does that work? And then what are the connections between these 3 big systems, between kind of the social and the built and the natural environments? So the piece that I lead, it's called the co-design theme, and which is language from the proposal, but also we've kind of adapted it. This is how we're defining it. Basically, collaborative work that's joined by researchers and residents and decision makers. In this case, what we're trying to do is kind of link all that data modeling from the environmental science perspective to on-the-ground preferences and local knowledge and lived experiences, with a focus on these kind of acute and chronic stressors related to climate in general in the area, and then with an output of those adaptation strategies. So the idea is we'll work together to create them. And these are just some examples from another project, kind of the idea of co-design, kind of co-production, working with communities to generate this knowledge. And this is an image from our first task force meeting that was in person last September, where some of the community members we're working with were kind of chatting about, before they start an exercise focused on problem definition. How do you define some of the challenges in this area? And then I won't read through this, but I just want to assure you, it's like we are really actively focused on the application, but we also have a bunch of like research questions as social scientists that we're investigating. Like basically, as community members participate in this process, how are the perspectives shifting, right? So I'm about to describe it. We've got environmental justice organization heads. We've got industry compliance, environmental compliance managers kind of all working together in this. So through those interactions and this co-design work, how are things shifting? It kind of the big thrust of the social science research. So I wanted to loop back to this because you know, I feel fortunate that we had a strong network of stakeholders in the area, but it, you know, it was a little bit like, oh, we got this money. You want to, can we work together now? And so kind of having that stakeholder network is not the same thing as like being able to say you have kind of community-centered climate adaptation work. But what we're doing now is like trying to basically how to figure out a little bit of reverse engineering. How do you structure this pretty large interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary, because we're involving people outside a research setting, project around kind of this concept of community engaged or community-based or community-focused climate adaptation with these things I was talking about earlier. I'm realizing I can't stand on this side because I have a little crick in my neck. I have to stand on this side. Sorry, that's better. So here I just wanted to pause and acknowledge, you know, I was a biology major as an undergrad and went back and did my master's in environmental studies. And, you know, as an anthro minor, I was like familiar with social science. But as a master's student, I got to take some classes with people like Bill Birch, who's a sociologist who did a lot of work in that the Baltimore long-term ecological research area. And first got exposed to kind of ideas of like participatory action research. But it wasn't until I came back to Texas and started doing this work that I really like started working on the ground with community members on kind of this shared adaptation work. So a lot of what I do has really just been taught to me from people from other disciplines like public health, like wonderful colleagues in other disciplines who have been really highly trained from the beginning in these concepts. And then from the people I've been working with, right? So through a now almost 4-year project in Dove Springs, working with GAVA, Go Austin, Vamos Austin, and a group of 30 residents, kind of learning from them what community organizing looks like, what respectful community engagement feels like, you know, what does it mean as a researcher? And it's not just making sure there's stipends, it's not just making sure that you work with people on collaborative papers. That is really important, but just kind of like the rhythm of doing this community engaged work. So learned a lot from them, learned a lot from this wonderful group of community fellows I've been working with through Planet Texas 2050 for a couple years, now working on Resilience Hub work. And then this past year, I feel like I've been an intern for Texas Target Communities at A&M because they have taught me so much about their community engaged research approach. They've been working in Texas for 30 years now, mostly in kind of smaller cities, small towns, rural areas, doing this really community engaged planning work. And they're just phenomenal. I feel like it's almost like as a social scientist, they're like a supercomputer that I have access to now. So it's like Texas Advanced Computing Center, except they're social scientists. So I can give them a slide deck I'm about to present, like in a couple weeks to community members and say, I don't see any jargon. Is there any jargon here? They're like, yes, look at all that jargon. Clean it up, right? Or I can help them. They can help me troubleshoot an agenda to make sure it's interactive enough, but we're still getting kind of our research goals done. They're just fantastic. So I've just talked about all these folks, so I won't dwell on it, but just that they really have helped inform this work in Beaumont, Port Arthur. And there's a bunch of these out there, but this is kind of the framework that Texas Target Communities uses, kind of this continuum of community engagement. It's a little bit like the ladder of participation, right? Planning theory, yeah. So there's a lot of them. But I would say for this project, we are squarely here. So other projects I have are more here, but we're here. We're collaborating, and I'm about to describe how, with these residents and technical professionals. We're trying to solve this problem of thinking about climate adaptation strategies together. But we've structured it through this task force where it's not just a group of advisors, but we're trying to get work done in these meetings, and the work is to focus on the adaptation strategy. And if they're willing to, the decision-making is in their hands, the residents' and participants' hands, like the site selection, where we're going to focus on, what kinds of things you are thinking about for climate adaptation. So we're hoping that it kind of moves this way, but it's a little bit of we had the funding before we had kind of that network created, so we're playing a little bit of catch-up. But I just wanted to kind of be clear on that. And, it's all it's all better, right? It's all better to have this kind of engagement. And there are projects I've been involved in that are much more, from the very beginning, community-driven, and that is an amazing thing. But it's also okay if it's not perfect, and you're kind of using these skills and concepts and tools to kind of move us towards that. So this is our basic setup. This is we're using this task force. I don't see it anymore. Task force structure that Texas Target Community has used in the past. So this is a group of 8 to 12 participants on each of them. There's 2. The idea is it's not so big that you can't make decisions together, but it's big enough that you have a diversity of voices. And we have them split into 2 different types of task forces. One is community organization leads, so leaders of environmental justice groups in the area, school administrators, school leaders. There's a constable, representatives from faith communities. So that's a community organizations task force. And then the technical task force is kind of professionals working in flooding and air quality issues in the area. And we decided to do this for a couple of reasons. I think as a planner, I thought this was a really important voice to kind of to have community members, residents, community leaders involved in this from the beginning. But we also had a really strong network of technical professionals already. One of our co-leads, Lee Hasselbach at Lamar University, has been running this flood coordination study for a couple of years at Lamar. So it's every month, hundreds of kind of flood professionals, local government officials get together by Zoom and learn about kind of a new flooding issue. So it was this amazing network to build on. And since we're focused a lot on flooding, although not only on flooding, it was a great kind of springboard to start with. So same thing, about 8 to 12 people. Their job is to kind of work with us through this co-design piece to do the climate adaptation strategy planning, also to provide feedback to the environmental data collectors about the data they're collecting. Maybe they're missing something, maybe there's another way to look at it. So it's supposed to be kind of bidirectional feedback for that piece of it as well. And then the community organizations that are on that task force, they go back to their communities, right? They go back to their environmental justice communities. They go back to their neighborhood residents. They go back to their schools and get their input and bring it back into the process. And it's a little bit different with the technical task force. I mean, they communicate with their professional colleagues, but it's kind of a little bit different than a community-based approach. So that's the basic setup. And for the community organizations, it's that local knowledge, that lived experience, their community champions. For the technical task force, it's kind of the technical knowledge of flooding and air quality issues. We have payment, stipends for the community organization task force because this is not part of their job to participate in this. And we also have additional stipends if for some reason, we end up focusing on a site in Port Arthur. So those Port Arthur groups are going to be more involved in it because they're running community meetings. So we've got extra funding for that. The technical task force folks aren't getting stipends because it's part of their professional job to do this, and many of them are public sector and couldn't anyway. So just kind of different kind of needs of the two groups. And this all says the same thing, so I'll just skip it. Okay, about 10 minutes. So this is what we've been doing. This is kind of just slide deck that I modified for today, but it's basically an update on our research from the first 9 months. And the first thing we're trying to do is kind of build that base, build that connection with community members to get these task forces off the ground. So for the community organization task force, as I mentioned, we have representation from schools, from environmental justice organizations, and from actually the constable for Jefferson County, who just won Constable of the Year nationally, which is kind of fun. He's a sweet guy. And then the technical task force, we've got representatives from all the drainage districts in the area, so kind of thinking about that drainage infrastructure that gets water out of the way when it floods. We have a representative from industry who's in charge of environmental compliance for ExxonMobil, which is one of the big refineries in the area, and we have some conservationists. And at this point, this is kind of our timeline just for this piece, just kind of briefly. We're like here, I don't know, where is it? Right there. And so we're kind of the beginning of this, 4.5 years remaining. And we're at kind of this part of the project where our job is to work with the task forces to understand how they're defining the problem. How are they, is it flooding? What kind of flooding? Is it the aftermath of the flooding when your home, has wet drywall and you got to find somewhere to live temporarily? Like, how are you defining the problems? Is it kind of the chronic air quality and you feel like your kids can't go outside to play after school because they have asthma and there's kind of this constant air quality issue going on in the region? So that's the part we're in kind of right now. This is a little hard to see. So kind of like right here. And then eventually we'll kind of get into that back and forth information exchange with the other kind of teams gathering data and then continue to try to build these climate strategies together. So we've had 3 meetings and everyone's been better. And this last meeting was in person, which is always better anyway. And I think it really well. This is some snapshots from it. And the meeting ended and people stayed, which is always a pretty good sign. So they stayed and chatted. But we had both task forces show up at the same time. And it was a little artificial because we asked them to sit in different groups because they were doing this initial kind of problem definition. So we wanted to kind of hear how they were defining it before they interacted with the other group, since we're guessing that there's probably different ways of defining the problem from kind of a technical and industrial perspective versus a community member perspective. So we did kind of this initial kind of a couple exercises in this meeting. We're doing baseline interviews with all the participants, and we'll do another set of interviews at the end to see how things have changed. And we did a short survey. So just kind of like different layers of data collection. When we did these exercises, we asked them to write down everything by themselves rather than have a facilitator write it down, so it's their own words that we're reading, things like that. So that's kind of, as we've gotten the kind of building that trust with our task forces, that's where it's at, and it's going pretty well. Our next meeting is in January, and we're going to start to select sites. And this, I just wanted to kind of loop back what that overall, the rest of the research project is doing to kind of get ready for the adaptation piece. The idea is that part of the team is working on being able to kind of create these models and these visualizations so that once the task forces have kind of picked climate adaptation strategies that they think are appropriate for these sites that we'll focus on, one of the things that we can do is create kind of visualizations of kind of looking into the future. If we created a new flood control mechanism here, if we created kind of this huge area of green infrastructure over here, you know, it's kind of what we're trying to do in SLUP with scenario planning. Like, what would it look like? How would it function? But the problem is, by the time we get that information from the task forces, it's like, okay, the grant's halfway done, and we have to like quickly make these visualizations. So they're getting ready to make them, and they're using a case study, which I don't think it's playing, but maybe I can get it to play. Or not. I guess not. Oh well. Oh, there it is. So the idea, like this is an existing piece of flood infrastructure called the Halbooty Pump Station. So you can kind of see the canal behind it. During a flood event, water will be directed into it, and water can stay here in this huge kind of giant ditch until there's space for it to drain out without causing flooding. So some grad students went down, they did a drone flight, they took aerial photos of this infrastructure, and then they overlaid an elevation map. So then we can kind of run models and say, if Hurricane Harvey happens again and we get 60 inches of rain, this is how it's going to perform. So the idea is that as the community members through the task force kind of design these strategies, we can also create these visualizations where they can kind of go out and talk to their neighbors and other residents about, okay, this is what we're proposing, this is what it might look like. And this was an interesting site to choose because there is a conversation in the community, both that this doesn't do enough, there's still flooding downstream, but also that if this were expanded, it would be taking away pretty good space for new housing at the same time. So it's already an area that's a little up for debate. So it may be a place that we focus. So that's what they're doing in the meantime as we kind of get ready for more input from the task force members. And the other thing we're doing just to kind of have an example to share with the task force members of like, well, what will this stuff look like? We have a couple pilot projects of different types of green infrastructure. And you know, as planners and designers, we think a lot about every place is different and context is different. So the soils in Beaumont, Port Arthur versus another place, the weather conditions, green infrastructure is going to function in a different way. So these are kind of pilot projects that we're running and collecting data from and can take community members to and kind of say, this is what a rain garden looks like. This is an example of pervious concrete and how this is how it might function under 10 inches of rain, for instance. So we're doing kind of that, I guess, like kind of setting the table, getting ready for the task force kind of structure to mature a little bit more. So I wanted to show you what they were thinking quickly, and then I was just going to wrap up with some things that I've been thinking about and kind of worrying about. And I think we have just enough time to do that. So in this joint task force meeting that we had with both the technical professionals and the community member leaders 2 months ago in September, basically what we wanted to do was get them to start working with us to define the problems or the challenges and assets, and also kind of identifying solutions. So we had an icebreaker, and Texas Target Community was a great help, like helping me kind of figure out the flow of this agenda, making sure it was interactive, making people feel at home when they got there and greet it. We'd all met online, but not in person yet. 2 different, pretty different groups of folks. So we went around an icebreaker about what makes you proud to be a part of this community, because then we get into a lot of like doom and gloom pretty quickly. Like, what are the problems? What solutions do you need? And it was a great way to start. So I just want to share out, these are pretty simple slides, but just kind of show you what people were thinking, right? For the icebreaker, really kind of the take home was, we love our community and it's the people that make it so amazing. And kind of in these comments, it was interesting. The community organization leaders were at one table and the technical professionals were at another table. And there was this commonality there. They used different language, but the community organization leaders talked about how this area is a sacrifice zone, how this area produces so much for Texas and the rest of the US in terms of fossil fuel production. but bears the brunt, the burden, right, of that production in terms of air quality and water quality challenges. And so we really focus on that. They feel kind of forgotten despite this value that they provide. And the technical professionals had like a similar theme, like just feeling like no one really understands how valuable this part of Texas is to the Texas economy. Within Texas or the rest of the US, someone kind of cited that 25% of the jet fuel produced just comes out of this small little piece of Texas. So the same feeling of kind of being forgotten a little bit. But also lots of focus on, wonderful things about family and kind of the natural amenities and, that it's just a very warm, inviting, kind of people-friendly place to live. And then as they have identified kind of issues and solutions, kind of broken into major environmental systems, talked a lot about inadequate drainage, lack of green infrastructure, missed opportunities for dual uses, which kind of means there's just a need for a lot more flood infrastructure in the area, but are there other things you can do from a land use perspective for that? So there's this great example, I forgot to put it in here, but there's this giant soccer field in Beaumont that's like 40 mini soccer fields for like kids soccer. And it's also a flood storage area. So when it rains, stormwater goes in there, hangs out, eventually soaks into the ground. And then the rest of the time it's a soccer field. So things like that. They wanted to see more things like that. Regulatory barriers. And then just a big concern that, especially, when we haven't had a big flood for a while, that people forget what's going to happen. And talked a lot about, if we do fire drills in schools, maybe we should do flooding drills, right? Kind of thinking about the communication of the climate challenges of this area and communicating that. And this is when they're thinking about kind of future solutions. We kept it really broad because, we're thinking climate adaptation strategies like in a very literal way, physical way, but maybe that's not where this is going to go. And I think as researchers, we got to, make space for that. They talked a lot about we can't stop water here. Water is part of our landscape. We're going to have to manage it, right? And that means more drainage. As funding criteria changes, just making sure kind of local government's up on that so they can apply for funds to not just plan, but implement, get this stuff done. Talking about kind of the relationship of kind of the downstream areas to the upstream watershed areas, and just the need for more information and data, which made us feel good because that is one of the things we'll be producing. For air quality or air issues, lack of knowledge about what's happening, thinking about air quality and pollution. So thinking about from the refineries, there's also some wildfire concerns, things like that as well, pollution sources. Thinking about reducing pollution sources, again, another focus on kind of education or communication with the public, more of a role for citizen participation or resident participation around air quality issues, and more research on air. So really a huge, I was surprised. I was like, they're not really gonna probably wanna see data already, but they wanna see data from the project already. So when we go back in January, we're kind of pushing the scientists to be ready, the physical scientists to be ready to share out data, which is hard because people wanna publish it first, but there's gotta be kind of a give and take with this. And then from a climate perspective, the technical task force, there were definitely some voices there thinking about what does kind of a post-carbon economy look like here, and like how does that conversation happen? And again, focus on building knowledge, awareness, kind of outreach, more participation, and then the need for kind of regional collaboration, mitigation, adaptation. We did not specifically, we asked them just broadly to define issues, and the community organization task force members, you'll not be surprised to hear, talked a lot about equity-related issues around health disparities, around quality of life, about limited opportunity for community participation. It did not come up with the technical professionals, and that's one of the reasons we went to split them at first, is to kind of see where kind of the sense of the room was. These are some of the things they're thinking about in terms of equity. Again, a lot of the same themes. There just seems to be a desire for more engagement, more participation, more information, more education. And these are some of the tensions, that kind of came out of it. Feeling like a national asset, but also feeling like overlooked and forgotten. Valuing industry for the good jobs it provides. Many members of the community organization task force, they themselves have worked in refineries and acknowledge kind of the value of those good jobs, but at the same time acknowledging like the day-to-day environmental issues that come with living in the middle of kind of a refinery dominated landscape. Talking about flooding challenges that can only be addressed through kind of a gray infrastructure, heavily engineered approach versus the need for more kind of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. thinking about ways to keep residents in the community. Some people feeling like everyone just needs to get out of the community. So this kind of tension of, and the community, that's a conversation that's going to come up a lot with so many communities, right, around climate change, is kind of the need for relocation, but the difficulties of that conversation. Thinking about how industry financially benefits the community and residents, but also feeling that the industry needs to do more, acknowledging the value of kind of the people in this area and the resources to ensure that well-being. And really viewing natural areas as amenity versus as a risk, kind of increasing risk of flooding from the rivers. And this, one of the community organization task force members kind of put it this way, just like this is, and it was kind of like, oh yeah, that's what we're trying to do, right? We need to communicate, break it down, this is what's happening, this is how it's happening, this is how we're going to address it, right? Which is more succinct than our research proposal, for sure. And then I just want to mention here that, whatever, the animation didn't stick on this one, but this last little piece, just things that I'm thinking about now that we're 9 months in, is that we were primarily going to focus on flooding. That was where more of our expertise was. There's a strong interest in air quality. That's a little bit harder to fix with things like infrastructure, like at the scale we were thinking of, kind of like green infrastructure, gray infrastructure. I mean, indoor air quality, filters, there are definitely solutions. But that's where interest is from the task forces. So we're going to have to figure out a way to kind of integrate that better into the type of work we're doing going forward. Something else I've been thinking about a lot is just the scale. Like the modeling's at this watershed scale, and we can't kind of scale these strategies to that degree yet. These conversations, especially in community organization task force, we're thinking about neighborhood scale. So it's like, how do you even like take that to a broader spatial scale? I don't know yet. That's something the whole team's been grappling with. It's kind of limited by like points of engagement, I guess. But something that we need to keep kind of interrogating and thinking about. And then the other thing is that these are busy people in the task forces. That's why they're so valuable, because of their community connections and connections to professionals. We only have their attention for a couple, handful of hours a year. They'll go back out and kind of network out to their communities, but thinking about other ways to kind of get that engagement. So we're going to do like a round of focus groups in churches in the spring as another kind of way of getting more input into this process. Eventually, when we have strategies designed, we'll go back out into the public and kind of get another round of input. But just thinking about the task force structure is helpful, but it doesn't always do enough. So kind of thinking about those structures. So I will just wrap up here. These are kind of some of the things I've been thinking about, both from this project and the project I work on in Dub Springs, and just kind of challenges. I think this has become really apparent in Austin, but this is an issue in Beaumont, Port Arthur too, is that so much of this climate justice work is done in partnership with community-based organizations, but there aren't enough of them. There's like so much demand for this work that it is kind of taxing these organizations, overburdening them. So what does that mean? And it also seems like places that need this work the most have sometimes the fewest community-based organizations. So that's a conversation I'd love to troubleshoot with you guys. Thinking about kind of the scale issue again, like this kind of community-engaged work, it is small in scale a lot of the time, but the issues that we're talking about climate change are giant. So like, how do you scale up, right? The work we're doing, the task forces, I think it's meaningful, and there are connections to broader community, but it is limited, right? Thinking about that, it's hard to think of another way to do it in this time frame, though. And the work I've done kind of through community-based organizations like in Dub Springs, that's also, I think, really valuable. But a community organization is not a community member. Like, it's different, right? There's gatekeeping that happens there and things like that. Through my work with the city, and we all know this as planners, that it can be slow, right? And then kind of get buffeted around a little bit after elections. And that's a challenge for this work, which feels really urgent. We're kind of going this way, and now, oh wait, we're not going to do it. We're going to do it this way. And then another thing I've been thinking about is, it's kind of like I feel like climate change really got real in Austin with Winter Storm Uri. And all of a sudden, it was like, well, who's actually going to turn out and help people during these events, right? And because it's a lot of responsibility, because it is, in some cases, a life or death situation. So that's something I've been kind of watching unfold here in Austin, just like who will step up to ensure that people have resources and information during those events. And if it's taking a long time for the public sector to get that done right, is it the role of the community sector to do that? What does that mean? I will say that my experience in Austin has been just like in planning, like when we do our literature reviews, we can really build on disaster research, hazards research, for climate change research. I mean, they've been around doing the same kind of stuff for a longer time period, so we can learn stuff from their participatory approaches. That's the same thing I find with city units and community-based organizations focused on disaster preparedness. They're like natural allies for this kind of work. You know, they might define it differently, they might use different words, but they've been there for a longer period of time than like an Office of the Climate or something like that. So they're a great kind of ally to leverage. And then the last two things, I think we all know kind of basic planning conventional wisdom that you have to pay people for participation or offer payment, in the sense that not everyone can afford to volunteer or has the time to volunteer or feels comfortable volunteering, right? It is hard from an administrative perspective to set up these participant support payments. I mean, at UT, you have to be able to pay a participant support in the way that I've been doing, you have to have a social security number for that person. That's not always possible in communities where I'm working. So then you give the money to a community-based organization, but now they have the headache of distributing it. So I feel like logistically that's been our biggest challenge so far, is like making that happen in a way that people know that the payment's coming and they're not kind of increasing that feeling of distrust of like, when am I going to get payment for this work? And the last thing is that this kind of research, I think it is really important, but it is really slow. And it's not really compatible with academia necessarily, with kind of the type of research production we have to do pretty quickly for tenure. So I just want to, I know everyone knows that, but I want to just mention it again. And then the last thing is that applied research is the same thing. I mean, it's, you know, hard enough to kind of, you guys are doing your PRs and your thesis projects right now and your dissertations. It's hard enough to see research projects through the whole research cycle, then also trying to be doing something like making a widget or creating a process or making these strategies. It's a whole nother level of complexity. And that's why we're planners, I think, those of us who are planners, because we love that connection between the research and the application. But it's also, it's challenging, you know, and it's, you feel really, at least I feel very committed to getting, you know, the production piece done, the application done, but it's more out of our hands than just completing a literature review. So I'll just wrap it up with that, and happy to take questions or go back or explain things again. So thank you guys for your attention.